Now, every year, he brings us a new way of looking at this rich history of his, and it just brings so much to our experience as docents in the DeGolyer House. So we want to please let Peter know how much you appreciate all the work that he puts into these. And Peter, this is a remote, so you can speak right in here. If it's the wrong height, adjust it, and this is a remote, so you can just flick your little heart out.
Sure. Thank you so much. Well, it's always a delight for me to be here. As I think Judy mentioned, that I've already begun to think about next year's talk, which should be something entirely different. And one could never ask for a more appreciative audience. So thank you all for the hard work you do for the Arboretum and for your interest in the DeGolyer family.
Can everybody hear Peter? No.
Pull it up.
See if that's any better. Bravo. Well, I will start out by saying the lecture is false advertising. The idea of doing Secrets of the DeGolyers sounded like a really great idea, but secret sort of implies that there's some sort of skullduggery going on. And I went through the 10 Commandments and found that actually my grandparents were pretty good Methodists who did not have a wild life, and I couldn't really find much to fault them for. You know, my grandfather's language could get a little salty from time to time, but really they were pretty good people. And I also thought about expanding beyond their generation to my parents, and that was a little more wild and crazy. And then I thought about the grandchildren, and I thought, no, there are a lot of them that are still alive. We won't go there. So anyway, but there will be things that the idea of doing a little known facts about the DeGolyer wouldn't fill the room. So it'll be, but there'll be a few secrets along the way, but nothing really terribly colorful. All of this is to say that I would know to a degree if there were really big secrets to impart. When I was a child, I mastered the art of kind of sitting quietly looking at a book as family gossip was being exchanged. I would just try to look invisible. And then Mother would realize that I was sitting there and say, little pitchers have big ears, and send me off to another part of the house to play. But I certainly picked up at an early age the idea of finding out what was really going on in the family. The Nell DeGolyer, we will start with. When I was a child, she was an amazing person, very much the grande dame, mostly with other people, very, very affectionate with her grandchildren. But as I've kind of learned to, seeing, reading things about her, David's book, others, and reading her letters in her own words and so on, and finding out that, yes, she was once a pretty young, giddy, fun-loving gal. And that, I think, is an important thing, I think, with any of us. When I was a child, I remember seeing in obituaries pictures of people when they were much, much younger, and thinking, well, now, who do they think they're fooling? And now, as a friend reminded me, I am now in the 4th quarter, and so, and I kind of thought, no, I don't really want to be remembered just as an old man. I'd rather be remembered at an earlier date too. So, but Nell was she was a remarkable lady and lived in very interesting times. Of course, she was born in Missouri, but moved to Indian Territory when she was a teenager. My great-grandmother, Goodrich, was some would argue, a rather ferocious woman who was very determined that her children would be well educated, and selected Norman as the location of the fledgling University of Oklahoma. And not by accident, all 6 of her children, 4 girls and 2 boys, were educated at the university. And apparently she had, there would be study hall every night at the dining table. And the expectations were very great for that generation to become successful in whatever their endeavor was. And Nell she was very talented in music, very good in languages, got her second degree at the university at a time before most people did their first one. And I really think that if Nell had never married, that she would have been a successful woman. And even without the connection with Dee to contend with, but she really was as I've also heard her described, a woman of keen executive ability. So, raw for Nell. Dee, on the other, yes.
Which one was Nell?
In the birth order?
In the picture.
Oh. Yeah, Nell is on the far right. And Dee, on the other hand, was more problematic. Dee was entering his freshman year, though he and Nell were in essence the same age. He entered the university at a time when Nell was in the shadow of graduating from it. She was teased about dating somebody from the university's prep school for people who'd had irregular educations. Dee's father, wonderful man, very intelligent, but who never seemed to focus very well. He was a restaurateur and a farmer and a prospector, and twice over an Oklahoma boomer, but was not really Nell was from a solid middle-class background. Nobody really quite knew what to say about Dee, except that he was very smart and very personable. And you can see on the left, he cleaned up very nicely, but at the same time, he was chancier, and besides, he had a funny name. And great-grandmother Goodrich was a hard-shell Methodist, and the idea that one of her daughters might be marrying into a French papist family upset her, so a myth was invented that the DeGolyers were Huguenots. But apparently there was no truth to that whatsoever. They arrived in the 18th century, well before the Revolution. But one way or another, Dee ended up first winning over Nell, and then even great-grandmother and great-grandfather. His major initial triumph was locating what was arguably the largest oil well ever struck. When we look at things differently, then people thought it was the best thing ever. Now, because a certain amount of it dribbled into the Gulf of Mexico, people would probably be horrified, but let's go for the original tape because his life was never the same afterwards. His employer, Viscount Cowdery, sent Granddaddy back to University of Oklahoma with a very generous allowance. And from then on, Dee's reputation was secured at an early age, and life just changed for him and arguably for the oil world. Dee and Nell, by the 1920s, were very comfortable, well established. They'd had 4 children and had moved in 1960 from Norman to the New York suburb of Montclair, New Jersey. And these were portraits of them from that early period. And it was so interesting because they weren't what I call checkbook millionaires of giving an interior designer, X thousand dollars and saying fix everything up. They were really connoisseurs in their ways. Grandmother would study auction catalogs and just step by step learn about everything, and Dee as well. Their first really major house was called High Wall, as most of you know. It was on a mountainside in Montclair, New Jersey. And the family lived there from 1926 or 27, I'm not sure, until moving to Dallas. It was I wrote my architect on my master's thesis at University of Virginia on the architect, and could bore you again with the story, all of that, but it was a great monumental house. That came from an old Christmas card, actually. The DeGolyers had fun. They spent summers for many, many years in Lake Winnipesaukee, New Hampshire, and they were in the 4th of July parade. The girls made all of the faux roses, apparently from Kleenex. And you can see the date, 1923. The family chauffeur was with them. And a good friend who's very good at identifying historic automobiles was baffled on that because you could see virtually none of the car. But that's okay. They loved movies. Mother was a talented amateur artist. Red-headed woman apparently was one of the movies of the day, but I don't think Nell and Dee went to movies so much later on, but in the 20s and 30s, everybody's diaries are peppered with what they had seen at the movies. And Mother loved doing kind of very, I don't know, they're sort of naughty women, but at the same time, between us and telling you a secret, Mother didn't know the facts of life until she was at Smith College, so. The family enjoyed vacations and had a series of huge Packards. This is just a period Packard, but it was the kind of thing that the family might do journeys in. And I think though it was a large, of the day, a very luxurious car, at that point, of course, the roads were terrible, directions were terrible, there was generations away from air conditioning, and there were 4 quarrelsome children. And there was a great story when at one point, I think on a trip to New Mexico, Granddaddy said, "I'd rather be nibbled to death by ducks than listen to you girls fighting." And promptly spanked them all. And Mother never said that was unjust, so. But it was another day in time. Nell's family, the Goodriches, were interesting because, again, things had never been quite the same for them after the Civil War. There was, my great-grandparents had lived in Norman. Great-grandfather was a dentist, but most of the children did very, very well in life, and largely through the oil business. Uncle Bob on the left was a Fort Worth oil man who ended up with a 32,000-acre ranch on Lake Buchanan outside of Austin. Aunt Mog was sort of the second from the left, was the flapper of her day, and she was great fun. And sort of her impish expression. Nell came next, and then great-grandmother Goodrich, who looks rather sour. Aunt Callie was, some say, was absolutely the sweetest member of the family. Next to the end was Uncle Raymond, a very successful Houston business oil man, who looks rather brash in that picture, which is a good fit. And then sweet Aunt Pearl on the far right, whose husband was a vice president of Amorato. The family, of course, came to Dallas in 1936. We know from grandmother's diaries for May, I've forgotten what the date was exactly, but she said, we arrived at the Highland Park train station at 7:15 to begin our life in Dallas. And this was the house that she bought. She and Granddaddy had been looking both in Dallas and in Houston, and had not found anything they liked until this particular house, which is on Turtle Creek Boulevard. Wonderful house, and I think probably one of the finest houses in North Texas at the time. It was built for a banker, curiously, whose last name was Everett, and very luxurious when he built it, and it was sold for between a third and a half of the price in 1936 in the depths of the Depression. But wonderful house, but initially Nell and Dee lived there with their 4 children, but in rapid order, the 3 daughters all married Texans. Uncle Ev went away to Princeton, and so they had too many bedrooms and not nearly enough of a library. So they began to look at places with a large acreage, and in the fullness of time, found a farm on White Rock Lake. The map here shows what the area was like, I think, in the 1890s, before the creation of White Rock Lake. The C.A. Lovejoy, there are 3 different surveys. The one, excuse me, if you look, right up here, C.A. Lovejoy and R.T. Taylor below. And R.T. Taylor is a very interesting character that I'd love to know more about. Max has done some work on him that added greatly. You notice it is R.T. Taylor, parentheses, C, colored. He was born a slave in Georgia, came to Dallas after the Civil War, and did very, very well as a farmer, and one of his sons was a high school principal, another one was a doctor, and the third had another position of great responsibility, but he had a very interesting obituary at a time that persons of colors were just ignored by newspapers unless they got into trouble for something. But when the lake was created, a certain amount of the Taylor had died a year or two earlier, and when the lake was created around 1910, the Taylor farmstead, the barns in the Victorian cottage were pulled up the hill to about the point where the visitor center is now. And archaeologists found some evidence of their occupation here, so that, as always, we assume that history begins with the DeGolyers, and no, it doesn't. You can go back at least 50 years, maybe more, to the earlier occupancy, and probably there would be prehistory things to be found there as well. The land that the house occupied was about 43 acres. That shows it in the very early days. The house was planned around the trees and the lake views, and which has something to do with its configuration with what grandmother called her crooked little house. And it was a remarkable place. Garland Road at that point was just a 2-lane road, and there was a story goes that when the DeGolyers had their housewarming party there, that between the time the guests arrived and the time they left, a sign was erected on Garland Road facing the outgoing motorists saying, "We didn't like your house either." So, this was one of the earliest modifications to the house. There was a wonderful greenhouse that was just off of the porte cochere, kind of over by the breakfast room. And apparently the wood was rotted at an early date, and it was replaced by the current greenhouse you see over there. I'd love to see this reconstructed in 21st century materials, but it was one of the earliest changes. You can also see a plan of the gardens. It is dated here as being original, but when it has Arthur and Marie Berger, they did not meet until well into World War II. And so this was probably just after that. It is the way that it remained for many years. I think the driveway is different. There was a large vegetable garden, which Dee claimed they were the most expensive vegetables in Dallas County. A second greenhouse was built on what is called the motor court, and just beyond what is now the restaurant DeGolyer, there had been plans for a swimming pool, which when everybody left, there was no point in doing it. But it's so interesting to me as an architectural historian, because so often both houses and gardens start out fairly modest, and then they're both added to. While in the case of DeGolyer, it was planned at once and constructed at once and remained intact. And the house still largely, the gardens have modified a lot because they can be seen. Their choice of sort of a mission-style architecture really goes back, if you look at this is actually in their house in Montclair, New Jersey, which in 1927 must have really confused people locally. But Dee was passionate about the history of California, Texas, and the Southwest, and did quite an extensive library. And he and Elle, for their old age, wanted a house that was going to be on one story, and as opposed to 4 stories for the Montclair house. And this gives kind of an early clue of what would come. Many of these furnishings ended up at the Indian Room, now the restaurant. The Montclair house was really solid. You can tell that it's almost sort of like a geological feature popping out of the mountainside. The granite walls were quarried just immediately over the Hudson River, and it has a real solidity. And when it came to the house in Dallas, Nell and Dee got the best people they could find. The architects were 2 young Californians, brothers Burton Scott and Denman Scott. Landscape architect Arthur Berger. It was his first Texas project, Harvard educated, and from 1940 until his death in 1960, he was arguably the best landscape architect in Dallas. Contractor Al Holmberg, interior designers Catherine Millard Pettit, later Audrey Price, antiques Park Burnett, which is now known as Sotheby's and elsewhere. The first gardener, Harry Bullard, later became a great florist in Dallas. And I've heard of a Giovanni Paschi attributed to the great plasterwork. And all of these things, I know occasionally when people will come through the house and say, well, my great-grandfather did the living room ceiling or whatever. If you can, take notes and contact information so that we can follow up. Some family attributions are important things we don't know. Probably some are wishful thinking, but at least we can have a better shot at verifying things. Dee was a great scholar, as we've said, and had a string of honorary doctorates from 6, 7 places. Anyway, major universities. And I know you know the picture of him in the library hall with what looks like a fez and a cape. I last wore that for Halloween this year. And people ask me what I am, and I sort of have to stop and think hard for something to say. And these 2 portraits, I guess we talked about briefly last year, they were both by an artist by the name of Alexander Clayton, and who've done presidents and many others. The portrait of Dee, nobody seems to like very much. He's wearing the same ring that he is in the portrait over the mantel, this ring. And it's a very sort of glamorous picture of Nell. And her neck is too long in that picture, but That's that with her wonderful cabochon emerald brooch and emerald and sapphire bracelet and so on. But this was supposed to go to University of Oklahoma, to the DeGolyer library there. Nell said, "No, I'm keeping this one." And so she sent up the 20s portrait instead. And a wonderful brash picture of Granddaddy at a I'm not sure whether it was a Senate or House subcommittee hearing. He was, it's sort of hard to describe, he was brash, but not really arrogant. You know, he wasn't afraid of anything or anybody, but I don't think he was obnoxious either. There was once I met a Houston oil man his father-in-law had been a co-founder of Humble, his grandfather-in-law was a co-founder of Texaco, but this guy was, I think, a little bitter by comparison, and once told me, "Well, Mr. DeGolyer could be a son of a bitch when he wanted to," and I repeated that to an uncle, and he said, "Peter, where did you hear that?" And I realized that I was wrong and should never repeat it again. Even Dee's secretary, after his death, when she was asked for a comment, she said that he had the highest integrity of any man she'd ever met, and was very much a gentleman in his way. And as you can see from Granddaddy, I inherited his chins. And Dee was a very dapper dresser. You can see him there in his full things, but there was as I've said here, in one of the books on Texas Oil Men, it said he was very rumpled. I kind of thought he was not. And his first trip to Brooks Brothers in the 19-teens, apparently he'd spent the equivalent of what it would cost to buy a Model T just on his own wardrobe, and was really very dapper. I can remember as a boy, the coat that was in his portrait at OU was cashmere, and I can remember how incredibly soft it was. And I love its feeling. The next generator, Dee loved his cigar, and you see it in the portrait there. In his defense, I will say, I know it wasn't good for him, but his cigars always smelled wonderful. They were the best made Cuban things and a wonderful fragrance. While his brother, my great uncle who lived with us, his were stinky and cheap. But in the next generation, the typical pose with my father and Aunt Cecilia, with a cigarette in one hand and a drink in the other, that was fairly emblematic of the next generation. DeGolyer nicknames. These are only kind of a starter set. Pipsy, in the D, Pipsy, Pips for grandfather, Nell, Mipsy, Mips, Bertnagel, Bertie, mother, Jenna, Genoa, mither, or mid to her children. On the rare occasions, mother was naughty. Grandmother would say, Virginia. Mother always knew she was in trouble with that. Aunt Dorothy was Doppy or Dot. Cecilia, Chachi, Chachawa, Seal, Och, Oma to her grandchildren from when Uncle George was ambassador to Germany, and their grandchildren went by the German Oma and Opa. Ev Jr. was Ev or Ev Haas. And Uncle Homer, Dee's brother, who lived with us when I was a child, was called Slug. Don't ask me why. Anyway, they're sort of fun to throw in. No secrets, the DeGolyers love to entertain. And you can see the 1940s parties with mariachis and people having a grand time. The dinner party, or luncheon party rather, again with presumably international visitors. Dee is on the far left. Nell is at the head of the table. Ida McNaughton is on the right side, but there were so many, whenever the weather suited, we would be eating outside rather than inside on that particular porch, which she called the portal. DeGolyer secret places. I couldn't avoid giving you anything. So the library bookcases near the desk you know about. The hidden door in the pine bedroom, which is where grandmother kept her jewels. An almost hidden door in the breakfast room. You can see the doorknob, but otherwise it could easily be missed. Some antiques had hidden compartments, and that, I will tell you, includes one piece that's in the house now, but I can certify that it's empty, so don't bother looking for sapphires. And there was, excuse me, that should have been small pocket. And Nell's dresses sometimes that had a little place at which she kept the key to the liquor larder. And she would entrust it to the butler Lang when they were entertaining. But I think she kept a pretty close eye on things. Lang, knowing her children and children-in-law, would do Planter's Punch with the strength of 3, just so they wouldn't be altogether disappointed. And there were probably other hiding places too. I just don't know. But it wasn't an obsession of theirs, but I think it was just kind of a fun thing to do at the time. The cases in the library were really for oversized books and for some of the rarest books. But this was a quote that I really liked. There was a pretty good book about Dallas and Boston and other cities that were published in the 1930s, or around 1950. And this particular quote, I think summarized so much of what Dee and Nell meant. Chief among the deep thinkers among the Dallas oilmen and the oilmen of the nation is E.L. DeGolyer. He is a scientist, a man with extraordinary intellectual powers, brought him recognition not only as the greatest living oil geologist. He's also the man whom governments turn to when they need the most expert advice available, but it found distinguished expression in a large and surprising range of fields. Lon Tinkle, later his biographer, who took pains to note his conversation in a single evening found that he talked about Diego Rivera, about alligators in their ways, about Charles Dickens, about what the Oklahoma legislature should be doing currently, about fine printing, the oil situation in Arabia, the meaning of academic freedom, the wintertime treatment for banana trees in Dallas patios, the habits of hibiscus, the statistics on Spanish colonial settlements in America, and his grandchildren. probably, as in no other home in Dallas and few in America, is there at the DeGolyers a steady stream of great scientists, authors, financiers, publishers, and figures of the great world. And yet these contacts are so born of mutual interest that the visitors find themselves there naturally. There's never any self-consciousness in the atmosphere, and more often than not, guests are privately more curious about their hosts than it occurs to the DeGolyers to be about their guests.
Awesome.
But this is only a part of the write-up, but it's a remarkable thing, in spite of the terrible name of the book, Lusty Texans of Dallas. Mal lived at the house alone for her last 16 years after Dee's death. She had envisioned that it would be used by SNU, and so she was very diligent about keeping the house in good order. She still entertained, did what was expected, very much involved in nonprofits, but it was still a quieter time. The house was very different than you see now as far as the kind of the ambience. There were virtually no hard surfaces, no sidewalks. The driveway was in pea gravel, and it was a very quiet place, except occasionally for a lawnmower or what seemed like a lot of traffic in those days from Garland Road, but very different today. But it was as I say, just kind of a very private place. The views of the lake were very open. Once a year, grandmother had a deal with the Dallas Parks Department that she could remove plants along the fence line that impeded the view of the house. And sometimes you really have to crane your neck to see the water anymore. She wasn't here alone. There was Lang, Mamie Wingard, Bertha Johnson, Dorothy Varner, Calvin, whose last name I never knew, Ernest and Lee Villarreal, Mrs. Greer, Dr. Phillips, the librarian, Nancy Savoy, the secretary. So it took a lot of people to make this place work. Nell had a variety of nonprofit interests, which are listed there. This picture interests me so much. It was at the time of the dedication of the DeGolyer Library at OU. And while people are looking towards Dr. Roller, who was doing the talking, you still have the feeling that Nell is the center of attention. And people were watching more what her reaction was to what was going on than anybody, than Dr. Roller or anyone else. It's kind of interesting, most of the women were still wearing hats in those days. Now with flowers. And I'm at her right-hand side. And Uncle Homer DeGolyer went over from the right side. But those were her children, in-laws, nieces, nephews, and so forth. Nell did enjoy her luxuries. You can see her chinchilla collar in a dress which she loved greatly, and her wonderful diamond necklace. And that was on her 75th birthday. And she had a mink coat, which my sister Virginia inherited, and Molly Bishop, who I regret is not here today, came to Canada last summer, from Buffalo specifically to deliver the old reproduction of the DeGolyer sisters' portraits to Virginia and her husband Jock. And as I say, Virginia very rarely wore the mink coat, but I did persuade Molly to wear it just so we could have a good photograph of that. You see Nell's initials on the inside of the house, but still I so much regretted not having Nell's picture here that we did some playing around. And we took Nell's head from the portrait and decapitated poor Molly. And decided that if she was wearing a mink, it had to be cold outside, so we found a winter setting by the LA. But anyway, we were very pleased with that. Nell had a secret crush on Perry Como. Nell had one of the first color television sets in Dallas, and she thought he was wonderful. Again, this is sort of a secret, not that anybody really cares, but Nell kept up her gardening interest very much. The bedroom patio had sort of denser vegetation in those days, but Nell also loved to travel still. She did that very regularly. My uncle at that point was U.S. ambassador to West Germany. Nell is a German major, loved visiting that when she could. She did an around-the-world cruise. She would take when her grandchildren graduated from prep school, she would take us to California to stay at the Beverly Hilton in Los Angeles, the Biltmore Hotel in Santa Barbara, and the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco. And that was me after my graduation from St. Mark's when I was young and pretty. Nell was also a very vigorous driver. I think I've told you that my father was her insurance agent and fibbed, and at the request of the family told her that she could no longer drive on the streets, but she had 43 acres to travel around with here. And other family members remember vividly, 40-odd years later, the grandmother was sort of, those of you of a certain age may remember the movie Wind in the Willows. And grandmother was sort of like Mr. Toad of Toad Hall. And as my sister Mary put it, she hardly ever drove over 40 miles an hour, and she hardly ever drove under 40 miles an hour. And the publication party of Mr. D was really the last big party from Nell's lifetime, and you can see in the picture she was, I think, 82, and she was old and she was tired. That was with
Gorgeous.
Yeah, she was, absolutely. And with her daughter, Cecilia DeGolyer McGee, her granddaughter, Marcia McGee Carter, and her great-granddaughter, Cecilia DeGolyer Carter. That was Chachi's, the cousin Marcia was business partners with Larry McMurtry, and he dedicated terms of endearment to Aunt Cecilia and her daughter and her daughter. But that was, as I say, kind of at about the end of the line for grandmother, who died in 1972. And there were several years of not having any idea what would happen to the house. This shows it when a great many of the furnishings had been taken out. The library had been taken out. And we were really quite uncertain about what would happen to the property. Many alternatives were considered, none of them very sympathetic. And so I agree. But fortunately, ta-da, the city of Dallas and the Dallas Arboretum came to the rescue. And Mel and Dee would be thrilled. We family members are certainly thrilled. Otherwise, there would be nobody to bore you with on stories of the family from decades gone by. Nobody would know or care much about Mel and Dee except a few oil buffs. And so we are delighted. We love coming back. A good British reunion there. My great nephew, Donald, going into the dining room looking very proprietary about it all. But anyway, it is my grandparents, I know, would be thrilled to have so many people enjoying their old home, their old garden, and coming back. We love coming back whenever possible. Thank you very much. And